This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Clive Farrell. Clive is a butterfly expert who established the London Butterfly House at Syon House and has dedicated his life to breeding and studying the butterflies of Britain and the world. His latest project has been to develop the 100 or so acres around his home in Dorset into a haven for insects that features unusual, even magical elements, such as a giant fibreglass dragon, a replica of a Saxon longhouse that's home to a huge bog oak sculpture, a temple dedicated to ravens, and a giant's chair. Clive's garden is the stuff of dreams to adult and child visitors alike, but also to the invertebrates which make their home amongst this garden, which is built just for them.
Well, I'm a solicitor by training, but I qualified over 50 years ago and never practiced. So I became involved in the property business because I reckoned I wanted to make a lot of money so I could indulge my fantasies, especially my butterfly fantasies. Butterflies and moths have been my obsession and my hobby all my life. And not many people are fortunate enough to make their hobby into a business. So it started really with the London Butterfly House in Syon Park. And I built the first butterfly visitor attraction in Britain. And it was only when David Attenborough took an interest in it and we made a film that the visitor numbers went up into the stratosphere. And since then, I've built 3 more in Britain. I still have one left in Stratford-upon-Avon that I'm very proud of. And then I built one in Switzerland, one in Florida, and a butterfly farm to breed butterflies, if you like, the raw material, in Belize in Central America. So we breed some hundreds of butterflies every week. There are 11 Quechua Maya Indians who spend their lives feeding caterpillars, and we then send them by airmail over to Britain, and we collect the box at the airport, and we keep what we need for our own display, and the rest we sell to other butterfly attractions and zoos, Britain, Europe, across the world really. But my home in Dorset, which I bought 44 years ago, is very precious to me. And it started with 10 acres of field and some derelict greenhouses. And I dreamed of making it into a native butterfly and moth paradise. First of all, as a very young man, it was only really the moths and butterflies that grabbed me, and the flowers and plants that they depended on I didn't know an awful lot about. But as I ventured forth into the field to look for rare butterflies, I became quite fascinated with the wildflower meadows and the coppiced woodlands upon which they all depend. And that inspired me to create wildflower meadows here in my home in Dorset. As the years went by, I was able to acquire more land around my existing holding. So now I've got 100 acres. I'm lucky enough to have 100 acres, and it's been managed and adapted and amended with butterflies and wildlife in mind.
So I think a lot of people who see gardens that are for wildlife tend to think sometimes maybe they are a little less kempt or less designed. I think that's a common misconception. But in your case, it's not that at all, because your garden is very designed and has an actual narrative behind it. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think this rewilding movement that's prominent at the moment, on a certain scale, I think it's quite a valid way of managing certain old farms and land, but it's really becoming an excuse to let, in some cases, to let your garden run wild and do nothing. And if you're not careful, you'll end up with a few coarse and vigorous species, especially the idea of making your back lawn into a wildflower meadow. It doesn't really work. You end up with an unholy mess of docks and couch grass and creeping thistles and all the other horrors. So unless you know how to do it, you're going to waste a lot of money. What I advise people when it comes to the back lawn, I advise them, if they don't want to scrape the precious, in inverted commas, topsoil away, I advise them to plant cornfield annuals, possibly with the addition of colourful annuals from other parts of the world. And like that, you can have a most wonderful display, which is everyone's idea of a flowery meadow. And when they fade away in the autumn, the birds will come and eat the seeds. But what you have to remember to do is it doesn't finish there. You have to eventually rake away all the detritus, cultivate it again, and reseed it. If you just leave it and you think, well, this has got established, that's got established, you'll end up with very few species, or in some cases almost a monoculture. So it's a mistake to think you can just sow it and leave it. As for perennial wildflower meadows, the trick really is to dilute the rich topsoil, because if you don't, again, you'll just get those coarse species and you'll be disappointed with the result. On a garden scale, it's difficult to scrape your topsoil away, and most people listening will not have the huge advantages that I've had and a lot of land to play with, and they'll want to know what to do on their own home scale. So there are ways of diluting the topsoil in a garden situation. Possibly the most successful, with a lot of work, is to bury the topsoil and cover it with the subsoil, and then sow your wildflower meadow on that. I've seen that work quite well, and the butterflies and the hoverflies and the insects and the grasshoppers and everything else will move in. It'll come to life.
Yeah. So your garden obviously is very, very large, but it's not without structure, is it? I mean, there's lots of different components to it. So I like how you've incorporated the design into the wildlife and vice versa. Are you guided by one more than the other?
Well, you've made a very good point there. You see, landscaping, indeed gardening, for most children is deeply boring. They're fascinated by some of the creatures that live there, the moths, the caterpillars, even the slugs and the worms. And landscaping is pretty boring to most adults as well. Even in some beautiful gardens, you see people wandering around thinking they should be enwrapped, but boredom sets in quite quickly. So in order to inspire children of all ages, I've incorporated some features here designed to intrigue, amaze, maybe educate. So we have an island of dreams in a sea of wildflowers. We have a nightmare garden. We have, I think, the world's longest dragon made of artificial stone. The children love, they climb all over it. I have the kingdom of the ants, which has given me an excuse to build a whole series of ant hills. And some ants have a very close association with certain lycaenid butterflies. And the shape of the anthills is such that it broadens the range of wildflower candidates from one extreme baked on the south side and the other extreme in the damp facing north and everything in between. In one place, as you've seen, I've constructed the world's biggest butterfly's egg, and I saw a picture of the brimstone butterfly's egg in a microscope, and I longed to have something on a much larger scale. So we designed an egg accurately, the right color, the right structure, the segments, and I had it made out of fibreglass, and I put it right in the middle of a round lake so people can know what a butterfly's egg looks like. The nightmare garden, so-called, which is composed entirely of weeds, to begin with, it almost happened by default, because there was a pile of spent, rotting silage, and it was smothered in couch grass and thistles and stinging nettles and the usual horrors of the farm and the garden. And I got to thinking about some of these weeds, and of course many of them, especially stinging nettles for example, are very important for wildlife, butterflies, moths, the seeds for birds and other creatures. So we developed a concept of actually making a virtue of these thugs and villains, and we arranged them carefully in banks around the round lake that I've just referred to. To nature, the shape doesn't really matter, but the human eye likes to see a pattern of some sort. So we made these spirals around the lake, and we dumped grass cuttings and various organic detritus on top of these banks. They became invaded by weeds. We did nothing. We just let them grow. And every year when we have grass cuttings, we just dump more and more and more on top. It all rots down into more and more soil. And you get this glorious chaos of docks, thistles, teasels, couch grass, bindweed, especially stinging nettles. And it becomes a haven, not just for butterflies, but for all sorts of creatures. The great crested newts that spend 2/3 of their life on dry land, they go and hibernate and hunt for worms and beetles in these banks. There's nesting birds there, voles and mice. And I get a lot of questions from people who manage parks or large gardens about this particular nightmare garden, because what do you do with organic waste? Grass cuttings, branches, you can't compost it all, there's too much of it. You can't burn it, it's antisocial. You can't take it down to the recycling, it costs you a fortune even if they take it at all. So we've made a virtue of a necessity, and it's an intriguing garden. There's so much life there, and it's so natural and so easy to look after. All we ever do is use a mower up to the banks, and we just keep it clear between these horror banks. I'm proud of that garden, but like a lot of things in life, it doesn't necessarily come at a big price. Certainly nothing compared with attending a fine formal garden.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, again, going back to that idea of the aesthetic being a driving force, but also the wildlife being a driving force, you've got a temple as well, which again forms part of the narrative of the garden, but it doesn't just form a part in terms of what it looks like, it also serves a purpose, which I was fascinated to hear about. And you rightly pointed out that actually it's something a lot of us don't consider. So how does it function for butterflies?
Well, the temple was inspired partly by bats, because it so happens that we have an exceedingly rare bat, a vigorous colony living here. It's called the Bechstein's bat. And the Dorset bat group come here religiously, and they've asked me if I would put up some boxes especially for them, which I was proud to do. And we've got records going back for years, and they're breeding here. I felt very proud of the fact that we were hosts of a rare bat, but not just Bechstein's bat, all sorts of other species of bats. So what can I do to help the bats even more? Well, we hatched a plot to build a broken down temple, and we built it out of dry stone walling, because I love growing plants in the crevices between stones, and it's a wonderful hidey place for spiders and lizards and ants and nesting birds. The tiny bats will go and live between the stones. So we built the temple out of a dry stone walling in honor of the ancient Corvidae tribe, a little known tribe that worshipped birds in the corvid family, ravens, crows, jackdaws, rooks, choughs, those creatures. The raven is the most intelligent bird in the world, and I read books about them, how fascinating they are. So I thought, well, a temple in their honor would be a nice thing to have. And one of the legends of these ancient peoples who worship these birds was that the raven was observing the full moon glittering in the night sky, and he longed to possess it. So he sent the jackdaw up to retrieve it and bring it back down to earth. Of course, the closer the jackdaw got, the more it faded away. So in honor of this full moon concept, around the temple, we've constructed 2 exactly round full moon ponds. And I'm waiting until we have a full moon. I'm going to watch them glittering in these ponds. And then in between the ponds, we're constructing ravens in flight, silhouette of a raven with the correct silhouette, with the feathers made out of wood. We're going to use 2nd grade Western red cedar, quite a challenge for the poor old carpenter. And then we're going to go over with a blowtorch to turn them black, which actually makes them resemble feathers a lot more. And those ravens will be propped up from the soil for several inches, and underneath will be a perfect hibernating space for newts and frogs and toads and hedgehogs, slugs, snails, snakes, so many other animals, because we don't think about what hibernating creatures need. Inside the temple, it's been constructed with enormous care, with advice from the bat experts, with all sorts of crevices and humid caves to make it perfect for hibernation and for breeding colonies. And as a byproduct, we've noticed a lot of peacocks and small tortoiseshells and certain moths, including the herald moth, have come in there and they spend the winter there. So it's becoming quite an important space for hibernating animals. And on top of the roof of the temple, it'll all be chalk-loving flowers, including the kidney vetch, which is the only food plant of the small blue, which has turned up here. It's breeding here. And then there's also horseshoe vetch, for the Adonis blue and the chalkhill blue. Those are their only food plants. And there's Viper's bugloss up there, which is beloved of hummingbird hawk moths, and we've planted lady's bedstraw, which is the food plant of the hummingbird hawk moth. So they will come in and breed, I hope, on top of the temple. So there's surprises all the time, unexpected things turn up, and that's the joy of managing this place in the way we do. It brings endless fascination, education, joy, colour, and we're looking after our wildlife.
So since you've been here, as you say, it's a long time that you've had the site and it's evolved over the years. I mean, obviously with your background, I'm assuming you've measured kind of the populations of certain species. Have you seen that they have dramatically increased?
Yes, we have, because we regularly set up a moth trap. And sometimes we have National Moth Night here, where all the moth people come from far and wide and set up their traps. And we identify all the species caught, and we've got records. So if moths are a bellwether, which indeed many ecologists think they're the right indicator, more than butterflies actually, because we've only got 60 species of poor old butterflies, whereas there's 800 macro moths and 1,200 micro moths. So as a sampling the study, moths are more representative of the richness and health of the environment. So I can honestly say that diversity is increasing here year by year, not just of moths, but hoverflies and birds. We have regular bird studies here, including mist netting by experts. Last week we caught a wryneck. Have you ever seen a wryneck?
No, never.
It's the most extraordinary little bird, and it migrates from Scandinavia through Britain back down to South Africa, very little known. And I saw one of these gorgeous creatures living at Rywater Nursery. And we have cuckoos. Some years we have nightingales here. So it's not just the insects, it's the birds and other animals that have come to live here.
Thank you very much to Clive for showing me around his amazing garden, and thanks to you for listening. Clive's garden is open to school children by arrangement, but not more generally to the public as I understand it. My thanks also go to Will Thompson, who is Creative Cultivation on Instagram, for giving me the heads up about Clive's work. The garden has built-in areas where butterflies can overwinter, and I think sometimes these undisturbed places where insects can see out the colder weather can be overlooked. Dr. Ian Bedford now gives us his tips on how we can help.
With summer over and autumn well and truly underway, the frenetic buzz of insect life within our gardens would have sadly come to an end. With the social insects closing down their nests and the solitary species having reached the part of their life cycle in which they try and survive through the often bleak winter months that lie ahead. And this includes all of our resident butterfly species, some of which will overwinter as eggs, some as caterpillars, and a few as pupae, all hidden away amongst the plants, hopefully remaining undisturbed and protected from freezing winds and frosts until the following spring. But there's also just 4 of these butterfly species that will remain as adults throughout the winter: the peacock, the small tortoiseshell, the comma, and the brimstone. Although with our changing climate, this might soon include the migrant red admiral and clouded yellow as well. Overwintering as a dormant adult, though, is probably the riskiest stage for a butterfly, and unfortunately, many won't survive to fly again the following spring. Besides being found and eaten by insectivorous birds and rodents, the dormant butterflies will also perish if they run out of energy, having not found enough nectar during autumn. They might also have chosen an unsafe hideaway, such as a log pile destined for a wood burner, or a shed containing dormant spiders that they can't escape from in the spring. Many butterflies will also die if they've settled in our homes, which often remain too warm for them to fully hibernate. But by knowing the different ways that our resident butterflies endure the winter months, we can definitely help to increase their chance of survival. Leaving the flower borders and hedges undisturbed until spring, for example, will certainly help protect any overwintering eggs, caterpillars and chrysalises, whilst growing plenty of late flowering plants, such as Verbena bonariensis and sedum, will allow the adult butterflies to top up their energy on nectar before they become dormant. Also, carefully releasing or relocating any that enter our homes during autumn, perhaps to an unheated shed or a garage, but remembering to help them escape from the spiders in the spring.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.